These are my potential conflicts of interest. So psoriasis is not all about moderate to severe and mild to moderate and mild anymore. We embarked on a Delphi consensus exercise with the International Psoriasis Council a couple of years ago to recategorize psoriasis severity. And through this effort, we came up with what I think is a very sensible way to think about psoriasis therapies. Patients should either be on topical therapies or they should be on systemic therapies. And the key aspect of this definition is patients who are on systemic therapies could meet a variety of criteria. They could either be a body surface area of more than 10%, that's easy, those patients get into clinical trials. They could have disease involving special areas, or they could be a failure of topical therapy. So this takes into consideration a few aspects of psoriasis that are more realistic. First of all, it's simple and it's dichotomous. There's only two types of patients, topicals or systemic, and it considers your response to topical therapy. You could be a low BSA patient, but if you fail topical therapy, you might be deserving of a systemic therapy. And it employs a standard and simple criterion, body surface area, not PASI, not investigator global assessment, something that all practitioners can gain access to and feel they have mastery of. And finally, it considers special areas of the body, regardless of the BSA. For example, the scalp, the palm soles, genitals, inverse areas, facial, nails, areas that could be solely affected, yet provide a high impact on quality of life for the patient. So in that vein, let's go into an oral therapy that we all know, apremilast, a phosphodiesterase type 4 inhibitor, commonly used in psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. And the company that makes apremilast embarked on a new indication for the drug, which is essentially lowering the threshold at which patients with psoriasis can be treated. You can see here the new indication reads, treatment of adult patients with plaque psoriasis who are candidates for phototherapy or systemic therapy, not moderate to severe adult patients with plaque psoriasis. It opened the door perhaps for the next wave of therapeutic indications in psoriasis. They did this by doing a simple study, 16 weeks, double-blind, called ADVANCE. And they enrolled a lower BSA population, 2 to 15%. You might know typical psoriasis studies for moderate to severe are 10% and higher. So a little overlapping, but dipping down to a very low threshold for BSA involvement. And they had to have a physician's global assessment of 2 or 3 on a scale of 0 to 4. So they left out the severe patients, they left out the mild patients, and just these intermediate type severity patients, 2 to 3. And you can see the BSA on average was 6, and the PASI score was 6 to 7. So they got the right patients, but interestingly, their DLQI, Dermatology Life Quality Index scores, were about 10, which is considered very high for any group of patients in dermatology. As a reference, the moderate to severe population usually lands at 11 or 12 on that scale, and the most that scale can be is 30. So there's not much difference in this population from a quality of life impact. The study design was very simple. Compare placebo to apremilast, 30 milligrams twice daily, 16 weeks, and then open label extension past that. Every apremilast study is designed this way, and there's no variation. And succinctly, they met their primary endpoint of PGA response, which is getting to people clear or almost clear over the course of 16 weeks and a 2-grade improvement from their baseline. So if they were a 3, they had to go to a 1. If they were a 2, they had to go to a 0. Now you can see here these efficacy data are modest. Only 1 in 5 patients achieve the benchmark. But apremilast is a modest efficacy drug, so no surprises here. And not surprisingly, the same tolerability issues arose in this study regarding headache, nausea, and diarrhea in about 1 in every 5 patients for each of those adverse events. Now, a different drug that's oral, yet possibly going to go into the same space as Dukravis. It's a drug that's not yet approved by the FDA for any indication. It's a specific TYK2 inhibitor by binding the allosteric domain of TYK2, not shared by the other three members of the JAK kinase family, JAK1, 2, and 3. More specifically, deucravacitinib binds the regulatory domain of TYK2 that isn't shared in the JAK1 through 3 members of the family. So it's oral, it's once daily, highly selective, 100-fold or more greater selectivity for TYK2 than JAK1 and 3, 2,000-fold greater selectivity for TYK2 versus JAK2. And specifically inhibits cytokine signaling that mediates IL-12, IL-23, and type 1 interferon. Particularly interesting is the 12-23 link. Those two cytokines we know from past biologics experience, highly relevant for psoriasis pathogenesis. If you inhibit those cytokines, you get efficacy in psoriasis. And here you see the regulatory domain binding is allosteric, subsequently inhibiting the activities of the catalytic domain so that TYK2 is unable to function. The efficacy data are generated by two parallel studies, Poetic SO1, Poetic SO2. Each is a identical version of the other, head-to-head with apremilast. And apremilast in the light blue, placebo in the gray, and you can see the purple line is your TYK2 inhibitor, deucravacitinib. Modest efficacy for apremilast as usual, pretty respectable efficacy for deucravacitinib. 59% or 54% at the primary endpoint, week 16, PASI 75. And if you carry these patients out to week 24, you even see a bit more efficacy. Probably safe to say 2/3 of patients over the course of 6 months get to PASI 75. I would say that's efficacy comparable to what you see for adalimumab and ustekinumab, Humira, Stelara. Adverse events, well, deucravacitinib did not have the tolerability adverse events seen with apremilast. As you can see in this slide, headache, diarrhea, nausea highlighted were low in the deucravacitinib arm and comparable to placebo, whereas you see about a quarter of the patients on the apremilast arm seeing headache, diarrhea, and nausea. A little bit more nasopharyngitis in the deucravacitinib arm, but no differences in AEs leading to discontinuation or serious AEs. These are some adverse events of interest, particularly those that you might see in patients receiving JAK kinase inhibitors, serious infections, zoster, arterial thromboembolism, deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, and then MACE. And in every instance, you can see deucravacitinib performs quite comparably to either placebo or apremilast. And we know apremilast isn't associated with any of these real adverse events. And so if deucravacitinib in this study of a large number of patients is similar, we have a good sense that issues related to JAK kinase inhibition are not gravitating towards deucravacitinib. Laboratory monitoring, similarly, because of the TYK2 specificity, it appears that laboratory monitoring that you might think necessary for a JAK kinase inhibitor isn't necessary for deucravacitinib. For example, no need to measure the CBC to my eye because there's no movement in lymphocyte, neutrophil, and platelet counts, no anemia. Comparable to apremilast as shown here in this table. Similarly with cholesterol, no issues with cholesterol, minimal issues with triglycerides, almost the same as placebo. CPK is a little elevated in some patients, but again, not different from placebo, and no issues on renal function or AST, ALT. So it might be deucravacitinib is a type of drug that is unique in its MOA, different from JAK kinase inhibition, not having some of the adverse events we associate with JAK kinase inhibition, and not necessitating blood test monitoring typically needed for your classical JAK kinase inhibitors. Now, what about the JAK inhibitors for psoriasis? We don't have an approved one. We only can use them because they're approved for psoriatic arthritis, and that would be tofacitinib and upadacitinib, or they're approved for atopic dermatitis, and that would be upadacitinib and abrocitinib, which is a drug unique to dermatology now, manufactured by Pfizer. Tofacitinib I have found is very effective for patients with palmoplantar psoriasis, and we published this in the journal Psoriasis and Psoriatic Arthritis. Many cases, I have over 25 patients who basically all show this behavior. If you take someone with palmoplantar psoriasis and you give them a couple months of standard dose tofacitinib, you nearly clear them or clear them in every instance. Baseline, this is 2 months later. Baseline, month 1, month 2, fully clear. This patient is now a year out, still clear. Very severe patient, brought to almost clear after 2 months. Again, I have countless patients who demonstrate this behavior. And I think this means JAK inhibition, at least in the manner by which tofacitinib does it, is a really uniquely effective approach to palmoplantar psoriasis that we don't see with our high potency biologic therapies. They don't do this as frequently. There's something unique to JAK kinase inhibition that leads to this outcome. And the question remains, will upadacitinib, which is now approved for psoriatic arthritis, work as well or better? Well, we'll find out soon. I'm going to start using upadacitinib exclusively for these patients, moving away from tofacitinib, and just see how my first 10 patients do. IL17A pathway inhibitors, it's well known in rheumatology. They're great for psoriatic arthritis, and we also know they're great for psoriasis. Now they're approved in pediatric populations down to the age of 6. That's the upshot of this part of the presentation. Ixekizumab, very effective at the PASI 90, 100 level, actually more so than it is in adults, down to the age of 6. These are the kids. This is secukinumab, and I highlight its efficacy at PASI 90. Really impressive, 73% of patients at the 300 milligram dose, hitting PASI 90 at week 12, and out week 52, a similar number of patients. And the blue line is etanercept, and the blue histograms are etanercept. There's really no comparison. Etanercept has been a gold standard drug for pediatric psoriasis for many years. Now we can move to IL17A inhibitors as long as patients don't have a history of inflammatory bowel disease, and that would be the major issue. I will say as an aside, my preferential drug for pediatric psoriasis remains ustekinumab because no risk for IBD, very easy dosing at every 12 weeks, and really quiet safety. Bimekizumab is a drug that blocks IL-17A and F, so it's a unique MOA. Blocking IL-17F brings into play another isoform of IL-17 that is found in high levels in patients with psoriasis, particularly in their plaques. So it is believed that IL-17 inhibition should encompass not only A but F to get the full range and potential of IL-17 pathway inhibition. Bimekizumab is not yet approved for psoriasis in the United States. That approval is nearly going to occur. It might even occur or have occurred by the time you hear this talk. In a nutshell, the efficacy of bimekizumab in psoriasis, in my opinion, is unmatched. 91% of patients get to PASI 90, all right? For reference, risankizumab, it's about 75% of patients at that level. So 91%, and at week 52, a similar amount of patients are still at that metric. So you're going to get 90% at PASI 90, you're going to get 70% at PASI 100. You're going to tell a patient there's a 70% chance you'll be fully clear by week 16. So a very rapidly acting drug as well. Again, probably the most potent and rapidly acting medication. The one downside is candidal infections occur in approximately 10 to 20% of patients, depending on the dose used. There'll be a Q8-week maintenance dose and a Q4-week maintenance dose after initial 16 weeks of Q4 weeks. The Q8-week dose will give you fewer candidal infections than the Q4-week dose. And just for perspective, the other IL-17 pathway inhibitors, such as secukinumab, ixekizumab, and brodalumab, have much lower candidal rates. Somewhere between 2 and 5% of patients experience candidal infection while on these drugs. But the bimekizumab, again, 10 to 18%, depending on study. So we're all going to have to be, quote unquote, candidologists to take care of patients on bimekizumab. I predict that most of these patients have mild oral candidiasis, which is easily treatable, and by far the majority of patients didn't come out of the studies when they had candidal infection. So it might be a minor issue that's easily managed. With regard to long-term safety of biologics, and particularly IL17A inhibitors in psoriasis, I want to point out serious infection rates. You can see all three of the IL-17s currently approved gravitate to about 1.3, 1.4 events per 100 patient years. And that's in line with the SOLAR registry range. That's a real world registry of 12,000 patients with moderate to severe psoriasis. That yellow bar is the range of serious infections, and you can see IL-17s fall within the real world range when they're in their clinical trials, and actually are very comparable to IL-23 inhibitors. So low serious infection rates in IL-17 inhibitors. So to summarize the IL-17s, we see drugs with rapid response, robust efficacy, more frequent dosing than IL-23 inhibitors. Occasionally they're underdosed at every 4 weeks, I would say. Comparable efficacy to adalimumab for psoriatic arthritis. We know they inhibit radiographic progression with good efficacy for axial disease, low signal for malignancy and serious infections, best efficacy for nail psoriasis, no laboratory monitoring. Candidiasis, less than 5% for the IL-17 inhibitors, higher for the IL-17AF blocker. You don't want to use them in IBD, of course, and they work really well for pediatric psoriasis. They join etanercept and ustekinumab with approval in that group of patients. Now, IL-23 inhibitors, we have three. There's tildrakizumab, which is our weakest IL-23 inhibitor. I say that because only 2 out of 3 patients get the PASI 75 at week 12, maybe a few more at week 28, and week 28 PASI 90, about 50%, I would say, and 25% at PASI 100. These are low numbers for the IL-23s. For guselkumab, now you're seeing PASI 75 at the 90% range, and you can see the plum-colored line is Humira, adalimumab, is a comparator. Out a year, you're holding that efficacy pretty well. That's a non-responder imputation. PASI 90, 3 out of 4 at PASI 90 for guselkumab, and PASI 100, about half the patients on guselkumab. So half the patients on guselkumab cleared at a year out. And that's twice the number of patients you saw with tildrakizumab at that metric. Risankizumab, a little more effective, I think, than guselkumab, just a slight margin. 3 out of 4, PASI 90, week 16, 4 out of 5, PASI 90, week 52. And by the way, it's about 60% PASI 100 at week 52. And dosing is less frequent for risankizumab. Everyone should know risankizumab and guselkumab because they're now approved for active psoriatic arthritis in adults. So these are drugs you'll get to know. And similarly, they're quiet on the serious infection level, in range with SOLAR, 1.2 per 100 patient years, serious infections. Malignancy, low rates, 0.5 per 100 patient years, and in range with the real world SOLAR registry. So fairly good comfort with regard to serious infections and malignancies in people either on IL-17 inhibitors or IL-23 blockers. So to conclude, the IL-23 inhibitors, robust, long-lasting skin efficacy, high PASI 90 and 100 levels, week 16 and onward. More than 50% of the patients on risankizumab, guselkumab are PASI 100 at week 52, with risankizumab slightly more efficacious and a less frequent dosing interval. But both are very nice in terms of their Q to 2-3 month dosing interval, very infrequent and probably tolerant of lazy dosing, where some missed doses don't really have great consequence on efficacy. They're sneaky in their rapidity of response. They're not slow drugs. They're not as fast as, say, ixekizumab, but they're comparably as fast as secukinumab. You will see at 4 weeks out, more than half the skin is cleared. And I told you about the dosing laziness. They have efficacy for psoriatic arthritis. I see this very practically in the clinic. Patients do see signs and symptom improvement with guselkumab, risankizumab, and the approvals are therefore justified. And they seem to have TNF level efficacy for dactylitis and enthesitis. Maybe, though, they don't stack up on the radiographic progression issue. So there, I would say more severely affected psoriasis patients should be biased towards TNF blockers and IL17 inhibitors, but a good choice for the more mild PSA patient that we commonly see in dermatology. No laboratory monitoring, low signal for malignancy, no candidiasis signal for these drugs. And finally, no IBD concerns. So a little less concern up front. We don't have to screen for IBD. We don't have to worry about candidiasis. Pretty quiet mechanism of action, IL-23 inhibition. So I end here with the current treatment paradigm, which I kind of led off with. We're not going to think about moderate to severe. We're not going to think about mild. We're not going to think about BSAs that much. Of course, if someone is a BSA 10% or more, they belong on a systemic therapy, or at least consideration, not just topicals where we torture patients. If they fail topicals, again, think about a systemic therapy or phototherapy. And if they have special areas, they might only be 5% or even 3% if it's palms and soles, 5% if it's just bad scalp. They can go on a systemic therapy. We open up what we might call the toolbox. Systemic agents, which I commonly still use, methotrexate, cyclosporin rarely now, apremilast, of course, and I gray out Dukravis, but it'll be there in the next year. Phototherapy, of course, and then all our biologic agents that are currently approved for psoriasis, with bimekizumab grayed out, but about to be approved. We are really in a very extravagant period in psoriasis therapy. I didn't even talk to you about novel topicals that are about to come to the market that are non-steroidal yet fairly effective, very respectful efficacy. 2 new topicals coming to market. That's another topic, but they will change the paradigm as well. You can always combine up therapies, biologics with light, biologics with methotrexate, if need be, for very severe and refractory patients. Maybe our biggest holy grail is getting drugs that stay working so that patients stay on drugs 2, 3, 5 years without loss of efficacy. I think that's our biggest unmet need with biologic therapy. Some key points to end up with when you're treating patients with moderate to severe, and look, and I use the term moderate to severe psoriasis, maybe I should just use the term systemically eligible patients. Choose the therapy based on the individual patient characteristics. That goes to special areas, failures of topical therapies. Not a stepwise approach. You don't have to fail topicals. If they walk in and 25% of their body is covered with psoriasis, we throw right on them a systemic therapy that works. One drug can succeed when others fail, even within the same class. I'm sure rheumatologists know that one very well. Combination therapy, of course, you're familiar with that. We do it less often in dermatology, but nevertheless, sometimes we have to employ combined therapy with methotrexate in some patients, maybe cyclosporin, maybe acitretin, maybe light. And always consider psoriatic arthritis. If dermatologists are doing right by their patients, they're always inquiring and screening for psoriatic arthritis, not only at the first visit, but each subsequent follow-up visit. Some of our drugs don't manage the joints very well, and that might necessitate a change, a switch, or a referral to a rheumatologist. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you feel like you learned something. My email address here at the bottom is for you to use if you have any questions you want to send to me one-on-one. Thank you.